Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of the Deep Cover podcast. This past week, we as a basketball community lost an icon of the game. Bill Walton, 71 years old, former center for the Portland Trailblazers, the LA Clippers, and briefly with the Boston Celtics, passed away at the age of 71 after a battle with cancer. And I wanted to talk about Bill for a little bit and also talk a little bit about how we look back at players from the past, how we speak about them, and how we ultimately don't give them enough due while they're with us on Earth. So, starting with Bill, I'm not old enough to have watched him in his prime. Of course, he played in the 70s, helped lead the UCLA Bruins in college to two national championships, famously winning 88 games in a row. Which, stop and think about that. 88 games. That's insane. That's more than a full NBA season, right? They were just that dominant with Walton and Coach Wooden at the time over there at UCLA. He goes into the NBA, drafted number one overall by the Blazers, and becomes instantly, after his first year, really, one of the best players in basketball. Wins the MVP, leads them to that franchise's only title, and was just magnificent. I've been listening to a lot of basketball historians who were alive to see Walton play in his prime, and the best summary I've heard is from Ray Marcano, who made an appearance on the Knicks Film School podcast with Jonathan Macri, and that was he was Nikola Jokic before it was cool to be Nikola Jokic. And if you ever watched Walton play in terms of his highlights and just whatever's available on YouTube, obviously not a lot of it is, but some of it is. And the passing ability was incredible. He was seeing things that no big man at the time saw, and it reminds you a lot of Jokic. It reminds you a lot of Domantas Sabonis today. He was an incredible rebounder and initiated the break better than almost any big man that we've ever seen in the modern day, right? Then things start getting derailed. He wins an MVP, a Finals MVP, wins a title, a couple All-Star game appearances. Then the injuries start mounting up, right? Now, to be fair, he had them right away in Portland. He had them in college, but they really became debilitating after his first 4 years in Portland. Missed 3 of the next 4 years, and that's after that he had signed with the Clippers, who were then the San Diego Clippers, which should have been a home run story. Bill is from that area in Southern California, and even after his playing career was very involved in the community in San Diego, but he only plays there for a few years of injury-riddled seasons, and he's just a shell of himself. The foot injuries, he got misdiagnosed, and it was just all this different stuff that contributed to taking away the prime years of his career. And this was in his mid to late 20s when this was happening. He eventually gets a renaissance and signs with the Boston Celtics in '86 and becomes a part of that team, one of the best basketball teams we've ever seen. He won Sixth Man of the Year, one of only 2 other players to ever win Sixth Man of the Year and MVP throughout their career. And with the Celtics, what he discovered the synergy with Bird and McHale. It was just beautiful basketball, and he eventually, injures his foot again after that and ends up calling it a career and retiring. Bill Walton is perhaps the largest or the biggest what if story in NBA history. There was a lot of guys who were derailed by injury. Grant Hill, Penny Hardaway, Tracy McGrady, a lot of guys who showed the promise and that they could be, one of the best players in the league if it weren't for the injuries. Walton was the best player in the league for a very short period until the injuries derailed him. And, when I think about his game, so much of it and so much of that era in the 1970s kind of goes unnoticed, forgotten. Everybody kind of looks at it as the worst era of NBA basketball because, in the 50s and 60s, you had the domination of the Bill Russell Celtics. You also had the Lakers with Jerry West. And then you get into the 70s and it's like a mishmash of these teams that won titles. The now Washington Wizards, then the Bullets won a title with Wes Unseld. The Knicks won a couple of titles with Clyde Frazier. The Sonics won one with Jack Sikma, and of course the Blazers won one with Bill Walton and Maurice Lucas and all these guys. What we forget in looking at it that way is just how beautiful of a basketball player he was. And he always took such joy in life. And that translated into his second career after playing, which was as a broadcaster. And that's where I was introduced to him. I was introduced to Bill Walton doing NBA on NBC with Steve Snapper Jones and Tom Hammond. And it drew me into watching basketball, to be honest, when I was a kid. In the 1990s, growing up watching the Knicks and growing up watching the Bulls of that era, the Magic of that era. And Walton was always there as this voice. Everything was hyperbole. Everything was, this is the greatest thing ever, right? Because that's how he approached life. Everything was this beautiful kind of tapestry of life. Everything was positivity. He is famously opposed the Vietnam War, one of the first white athletes to speak out against that, in addition to what athletes like Muhammad Ali did to oppose the war efforts at the time in the 60s and 70s. And he was just a beaming personality with positivity. In the wake of his passing, so many people have come out and shared little anecdotes, little stories. It could be something as small as what he did to prep for an interview, or something as big as how he changed somebody's life. Mike Breen told a great story on ESPN about how he took his father, who was struggling with illness, Parkinson's, to San Diego military base, and Walton just rolled out the red carpet for him, and it made him love Walton and appreciate, and gave him a moment of happiness in an otherwise situation that was riddled with pain. And that's the kind of guy Bill Walton was, right? He was very positive. He was very outgoing. His personality was the biggest in the room. He was an avid music fan, known super fan of the Grateful Dead. Everybody all the players that knew him kind of came out and said, well, who's going to tell me to listen to the Grateful Dead now? And, that's just the kind of personality he was. He was an icon of icons in the NBA circles. And eventually later in life, he did Pac-12 commentary with Dave Pasch. And, again, that same bombastic style that just permeated the whole room. And a lot of times he felt like a guy that you would just be watching a game on the couch with, and you're just having conversation while the game is going on. And that lightness, that approach was polarizing. Some people loved it, other people hated it, right? But it was decidedly Bill Walton. And in the wake of his passing, I've had a few different kind of things that I've been considering. The first of which is how we choose to remember players after they pass. And I'm guilty of this. I'm sure you're guilty of it. When a player passes away, whether it's prematurely or at an older age, that's when the videos, the podcast episodes, the articles are all produced and written and recorded, recapping this great career. And it happened when Willis Reed passed away recently. It happened when Bill Russell passed away. It will undoubtedly happen when Kareem Abdul-Jabbar passes away. It's just something we do, right? We memorialize somebody, give them their last piece of flowery sort of recognition, and then that's that. And it makes you wonder, is there a better way that we could be doing that? Is there a better way to kind of memorialize and glorify somebody, before they've left us. For many, Bill Walton specifically, a lot of people thought he was kind of weird. A lot because, to be quite frankly, maybe he was. He wasn't really everybody's cup of tea. The way he went about speaking about the game of basketball, it was poetic, but not every poet is for everybody, right? And when we look back at how people speak about Walton, it's always with sadness, right? There's a very good argument to be made that he was the greatest, if not the second greatest behind Kareem, college basketball player of all time. Again, 88-0, centerpiece of that team, only lost 4 games in college before heading to the pros. And he was also likely, even though he only played there for 4 years, the greatest trailblazer that ever lived, and that's taking into account other players they've had, LaMarcus Aldridge, Damian Lillard, Clyde Drexler, Clifford Robinson. These are all excellent players, and some of them Hall of Fame players that have been tremendous assets to the league. But Walton, in a short amount of time, he's probably the best Blazer ever. And some might disagree, but at the worst, he's in the top 3, right? And instead of focusing on that and what he was on the court, we often instead focus on what he wasn't, which was a healthy basketball player. And Walton, when he was alive, would always say that he's the luckiest guy in the world. And, it could be argued he was one of the unluckiest guys in the world in the context of NBA superstardom, because the injury after derailment after injury, you can only imagine how frustrating that is for somebody like Walton, who loves basketball, loves the game he plays, and has had a love affair with it since he was a kid. But he always had that positive mentality. But when we talk about him, we attribute him as part of the Portland Trail Blazers curse of high draft picks, in the sense of you had Walton in the 70s, you had Sam Bowie in the 80s, you had Greg Oden and Brandon Roy in the post 2000s. And, we kind of lump Walton in as, a person who was part of that, so quote unquote curse of the Blazers. And we often, wonder what he could have been if he was actually able to stay healthy, or maybe if he had the benefit of modern medicine that a lot of teams and players have now. It seems like it's a somewhat dismissive way to look at it, I think, where we're focusing on the fact that he wasn't Kareem in terms of longevity, but not focusing on the fact that Walton probably had one of the best 1 to 2 year stretches when the Blazers won the title. And he was the best player in basketball, who led his team to a championship. And that should have been celebrated more. His achievements as a broadcaster should have been celebrated more, but ultimately they weren't, because it boils down, I think, to how we talk about eras in basketball and how we look at them in the grand scheme of things. I remember on TikTok a little while ago, there was this little trend on the NBA niche, the sports niche of that app, saying that we're not acknowledging the 1990s anymore, right? That and it is of course rooted in the Michael Jordan versus LeBron James debate, which is now just played out to the point of exhaustion. But it was basically saying, look at the clips of these teams back then. Look how little spacing they had. Look how unathletic they were compared to the players that we have today. And it's a fair point, because it was kind of a pushback, from this generation of fans to the generation around my age that were always saying, well, you didn't watch it, you didn't see the defense, so on and so forth. And I always felt like comparing eras is stupid, because the game is so different. If we're really going to, you can't compare Bob Cousy to Steph Curry. There was no 3-point shot, for example, right? It's just there's too much difference. It's a totally different game, between multiple generations. But at the same time, this is what we do, right? We compare greats. And when we talk about the great centers, a guy like Bill Walton isn't just compared to his contemporaries like Wes Unseld, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and what have you, it's compared to, yeah, but was he better than Shaq? Yeah, but was he better than Jokic? Yeah, but was he better than Olajuwon? That sort of thing. And I think that we often need to be able to look at the game and the players in it in a little bit more of a vacuum. What did he accomplish in his era, right? Is the better situation. And because a lot of people want to prop up the player that they like, the current player that they like, or the former player that they like. Like, I'll use an example. A friend of mine is a big Wilt Chamberlain guy, right? He thinks Wilt Chamberlain is the best player that ever played. And that's strictly from a numbers perspective, right? That he has a 100-point game. Any sort of like crazy scoring streak or record generally is owned by Wilt Chamberlain outside of most total points scored. And to him, that's dominance on another level. The critics of Wilt would say, oh yeah, well, who is he playing against? To use a JJ Redick term, he was playing against plumbers and firemen, right? And it just feels disrespectful to that era. And a good friend of mine, Ariel De Jesus, he does a podcast called Gold School Retro, which kind of talks about these older players from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and just highlights their careers, right? In ways that more often that they are not, right? And I think that that's where we as a viewing public kind of fall flat, and we look at the 70s as like this prehistoric era. Nobody's even worth mentioning because to many people the league didn't start until Larry Bird and Magic Johnson entered it. And I've fallen guilty to this. I'm sure you have as well. Where you get roped into a debate between LeBron James and Michael Jordan, or you get roped into is Kevin Durant the best scorer of all time, and then somebody will tell you, yeah, but Pete Maravich existed, and it's a fruitless exercise that I think diminishes so much of what great players did. Use another example from the 90s, Gary Payton. So Gary Payton was, of course, a defensive savant for the Seattle Supersonics when he was playing. And he, a lot of times, gets overlooked now because of the way the styles of play have shifted. And I think it's better to look at it as, hey, here's one of the best smaller perimeter defenders that we've seen, and because he dominated his era, right? I think if you dominate your era, you deserve to be classified as one of the best ever. And instead of figuring out who's the best, I think it's a pool of the best. But the issue is that we like having these greatest of all time debates and all that. And I've been reading Mike Greenberg's book, Got Your Number, which is a pretty fun read. It kind of associates numbers from 1 to 100 of great players. And, I got to chapter 34, which for the number 34 was memorializing Walter Payton. And, Walter Payton, of course, passed away prematurely from cancer in his 40s. And I often wonder, he got so much criticism in Chicago as a player, because after 85 and, when they couldn't get, certain things done, and he obviously suffered, a lot of injuries from wear and tear and all that, was he appreciated the way that he should have been appreciated? Did he feel that before he passed? And I think that's the key takeaway here. And, Walton Bill Walton has experienced a lot of great words and videos and memorializations. I just wish that maybe he should have gotten those while he was still here, right? And how do you fix it? It's tough because by nature, we're going to focus on the now and the future. It's not always going to be about remembering the past. But I think I would leave it with this, right? I think one of the best ways to memorialize a great athlete is when a record gets passed or an achievement it comes up that player did. I think it's important to at that point celebrate how great that player was, right? So when LeBron James passed Kareem Abdul-Jabbar for the most points scored in NBA history, the focus, rightfully so, right, was on this tremendous accomplishment in LeBron's career. But I feel like a footnote should have been consider how good that record was by considering how good Kareem was, right? And that way you're honoring the current and also honoring the past. I think far too often we focus on tarnishing the past in the sake of elevating the current, right? And I think that's a little problematic because I think we should all be historians of the games that we watch and love and pay money to see in various ways over the years. Like, we are huge fans of everything, right? I look at like something like the Detroit Lions. They're finally starting to have some success. They have a great running back in Jameer Gibbs. If Jameer Gibbs sticks with the Lions and he ends up breaking any of Barry Sanders' records, I feel like that moment should celebrate Jameer Gibbs, but also celebrate the greatness that was Barry Sanders as a Detroit Lion, right? And that is the thing that I care about the most, just as somebody who has now watched multiple eras, and I'd like for a little bit more appreciation to be put into it. I think back to a post I shared on Facebook the other day where somebody was, again, a LeBron Jordan debate, and you'll find a lot of this era disrespect comes from the LeBron Jordan debate. And they were saying, look at the teams LeBron had to go through versus the teams that Jordan did, and the two case studies they had were the 2004 through 2009 era Detroit Pistons, which of course beat the Lakers in '04, versus the late '90s Indiana Pacers with Reggie Miller, Mark Jackson, Rick Smits, and all those other guys, Chris Mullin. And they're like, oh, it's not even a contest. And I shared it out, and I'm a Knicks fan. I'm bred to despise the Indiana Pacers. But when you take into the fact that that team featured a 7'4" skilled big man in Rick Smits, one of the best floor general point guards in Mark Jackson, a young Jalen Rose who was ascending into the league. It also featured one of the best shooters of all time, Reggie Miller, and another great shooter in Chris Mullin, both of them who shot over 40% from three in the 90s on over 4 attempts, which was unheard of back then, right? And we're just disrespecting them because we have this perception of a weak era. And, I got pushback from a friend of mine. He's like, well, that Pacers team wouldn't have lasted a game with the the Lakers team that the Pistons beat. And I think we're so dismissive of older eras because we consider the lens of which the game is played today. And I think it causes a lot of fault lines and holes in the way that we view greatness. And I think if we had a bigger appreciation for the past, maybe we could have an even deeper appreciation for the present, understanding just how special what these guys do is in comparison to what was done before them. All right, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or you can also subscribe directly on deepcover.substack.com, where you'll also receive weekly articles in addition to the podcast. Till next time, we'll see you next week on the Deep Cover Podcast. See ya.